What happens when a young Navy SEAL recognizes a legend the world forgot, sitting alone in a diner? It was raining sideways the morning everything changed, not the soft kind of rain that whispers on windows. This was sharp, stinging rain, slapping the pavement, drenching the sidewalks, chasing people indoors. And inside Marcy's diner, the windows fogged with warmth, the smell of bacon and burnt coffee hung in the air like it always did. It was a small place, not fancy, just two waitresses, a cook you never saw, and enough regulars to keep the doors open. At the back, by the corner window, sat Walter Drummond. Everyone just called him Mr. Walt. He didn't say much, never did. Same booth, same coffee, black, same eggs, over easy, toast dry, no fuss, no phone, just a newspaper and the occasional cough into his napkin. If you weren't paying attention, you'd never think twice about him. But on that Tuesday morning, someone did. That someone was Caleb Mercer, a 24-year-old Navy SEAL just back from a rough tour and a bad breakup. He wasn't trying to find anything that day, just shelter from the rain and something warm to eat. His aunt had told him Marcy's was old but reliable. He figured she meant it was cheap. Caleb walked in with his hoodie soaked through, boots squishing a little as he stepped. He nodded once to the woman at the counter, wiped his shoes on the mat, and scanned the room for an empty seat. And that's when he saw him. Back in the booth, by the window, Mr. Walt stirred his coffee, sleeve pushed just high enough to show a mark. Faded, worn by time, but unmistakable to the trained eye. A skull inside a parachute. Two crossed arrows below it. 1st Recon Battalion. Caleb stopped moving. His body just held still. Not out of fear, not confusion. It was recognition. Like finding a word you've been trying to remember for years, and suddenly, it's just there. He didn't even realize the waitress was speaking to him. "You all right, hun?" she asked. He blinked, nodded. Yeah, sorry, I'll sit over there." He didn't point. He didn't need to. He was already walking toward the booth. The closer he got, the more his thoughts raced. Could it really be him? That tattoo wasn't common, not like the anchors or flags you saw on every bar bouncer. That was old school, rare, reserved for a breed of Marine they barely even talked about anymore. Caleb had heard stories, one in particular, a black recon scout in Vietnam. Guy pulled 6 men out of a kill zone with no radio, no backup, and a broken leg. Crawled them out through the jungle for 2 days, bleeding the whole way. But the man never gave interviews, never accepted a medal, just disappeared when the war ended. Some said he died, others said the government kept him quiet. Caleb always figured the story was half made up. Now here was this old man with that tattoo sitting in a diner like it meant nothing. Caleb took a deep breath, walked over, stood by the booth. "Sir, excuse me," he said, voice tight. Mr. Walt didn't look up. Caleb swallowed. "I couldn't help but notice your tattoo. That's 1st Recon, right?" A long pause, then a quiet, tired voice. "Long time ago." Caleb's heart thudded. "Were you there? Vietnam?" Mr. Walt stirred his coffee again. "I was a lot of places. You military?" "Yeah, Navy, SEAL." Walt looked up then, just for a second. His eyes, clouded by age, flicked across Caleb's face, then dropped back to the coffee like the moment had never happened. "What do you want?" he asked. Caleb hesitated. "To say thank you." That got a real look. Slow, direct, measured. Walt leaned back just slightly. "What for?" "You don't know me," Caleb said, "but I know stories. And if you're who I think you are, you're the reason I joined." Walt said nothing, just tapped his spoon on the edge of the cup. Once, twice. Then he gestured at the seat across from him. "You eat yet?" Caleb blinked. "No, sir." "Then sit down. Nobody talks on an empty stomach." But Caleb didn't know that sitting down would be the start of something that hadn't been spoken in over 50 years. Caleb slid into the booth, the vinyl seat sticking slightly to his damp clothes. He didn't care. He sat straight, alert, like he was back in a briefing room waiting for orders. Mr. Walt, on the other hand, moved like time didn't push him around anymore. He lifted his cup, took a long sip, and let silence stretch between them like it had weight. The waitress came by, small, wiry, probably in her 60s, with a sharp voice softened by years of customer service. "You want coffee?" she asked Caleb without looking up from her pad. "Please," he said. She poured. The sound filled the space like a release valve. "You want food?" she asked. "I'll have what he's having," Caleb replied. Walt raised one eyebrow. Not much, just enough for Caleb to see it. "Brave man," Walt muttered. "They overcook the eggs every time." The waitress smiled slightly as she walked off. Caleb relaxed a fraction. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, fiddling with the sugar packet. That tattoo, you don't see many like it." "No, you don't," Walt replied. "You know what it means?" Caleb nodded. "First Recon, Marine Corps, one of the oldest units." Walt hummed low in his throat. "That's the pamphlet version." He leaned forward then, rested his elbows on the table. His sleeves were pushed up now, and Caleb could see more than just the skull. There were small scars around it, faded burns, lines like tree bark, textured and deep. "You ever been dropped into the middle of nowhere with just a map and a canteen?" Walt asked. Caleb nodded slowly. "Not a map, GPS, but yeah, Afghanistan, Syria, Philippines." Walt looked at him again, a little longer this time. Different wars, same mess. Their food came. 2 plates of eggs, toast, and limp bacon. Walt thanked the waitress softly, then picked up his fork like the conversation hadn't paused. Caleb didn't know how far he could push, but the man across from him was a door that didn't open easy. He had to knock with care. "People used to talk about you," Caleb said, "in training. Some said you were a myth." Walt chuckled once, dry and fast. "That's the best thing a soldier can be after a war. A myth means you kept quiet." "You saved 6 men," Caleb pressed, "with a busted leg. Carried one on your back, 2 days through the jungle." Walt didn't respond right away. He chewed his eggs, drank his coffee. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "Wasn't 6, was 5. One bled out halfway through. Name was Fenton, North Carolina boy. Good aim, bad luck." The air between them changed. Caleb could feel it. The weight of names no one said anymore. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Don't be. Just means you listen." Walt pushed his plate away. His appetite was already gone. Caleb took another bite, unsure whether he was hungry or just nervous. "I didn't come back to parades," Walt said. "Didn't expect any. They didn't want men like me on the front page. Black face, battlefield hero. That didn't sell newspapers." Caleb shifted, unsure what to say. "People talk," Walt continued, "but they forget. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because nobody else was going to carry those boys out. And I knew if I left them, they'd rot in that jungle, and their mamas would get a telegram instead of a folded flag." His hands tightened around his coffee cup, knuckles pale against dark skin. "I carried them because that was the job. But when I got back, that job didn't mean much. Not in the real world." Caleb looked down. He'd read the reports, the hidden history. How many veterans, especially black ones, came home only to be denied benefits, respect, or even jobs? "I didn't know what happened to you," Caleb said. "Nobody did." "That's because I didn't want them to," Walt replied. "You get tired of answering questions about the worst days of your life." A pause, then softer. "You ever lose someone over there?" Caleb nodded slowly. "Couple. My best friend, Amir. IED outside Kandahar. He was gone before we could even reach him." Walt met his eyes. For the first time, there was understanding. Not pity, just 2 men, both carrying ghosts. But Caleb had more questions that had waited years to be answered, and Walt wasn't sure he wanted to open that door. The eggs were cold now. Neither of them had touched their plates in minutes. Caleb leaned back slightly, cradling his mug, staring out the rain-soaked window. Cars moved slow outside, like they too were unsure whether to stop or keep going. Inside, the diner had gone quiet. A couple at the far table murmured to each other over pancakes. A delivery guy stood near the door, shaking water from his cap. But at that booth near the window, it felt like the rest of the world had faded out. "I always thought your name was made up," Caleb said finally. Walt raised an eyebrow. "How you mean?" "In Bud's training, we'd sit around talking about legends, guys who did the impossible. Some said your name was Walt Drummond. Others called you Ghostwalker. Some said you were taken by the CIA. A few thought you went crazy in the jungle and just stayed out there. Walt smiled, not amused. People always need stories, helps them sleep. But the part that stuck, Caleb said, was how every version ended the same way. No body, no interview, no photo, no fame. Just a man with a busted leg dragging 5 Marines through hell. Walt said nothing. Caleb studied him. You didn't want to be found, did you? I didn't need to be, Walt said simply. Caleb hesitated. But why disappear? You could have written a book, given talks, inspired people. Walt let out a quiet laugh. You think the world wanted a black Marine talking about burning villages and carrying dying boys on his back? You think they'd let me sit on TV and say we weren't heroes? We were survivors? Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. Walt sat back and folded his arms. Back then, I came home to a front porch covered in spit and a VA line that wrapped around the building. Nobody asked me what happened over there. They just told me to move on. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. And you did, Caleb said. I tried. I got a job hauling scrap. Lived in an apartment above a dry cleaner. Drank a little too much. Slept a little too little. One day, I stopped trying to be anything but invisible. Caleb sat with that for a moment. But you're not invisible, he said. Not to me. Walt looked at him long and slow. Why are you really here? Caleb paused. I don't know. Sure you do. There was a beat of silence before Caleb finally spoke. I lost my team leader 3 months ago, guy named Morales. He was like a brother, calm under pressure, always made us feel like we'd make it back. We hit a compound near Ramadi. He stepped on a pressure plate while moving forward. We all knew the sound. He looked at us, smiled, said, "Don't come any closer," and that was it. Walt didn't speak. His eyes dropped slightly as if remembering something. I keep thinking, Caleb said, voice low, that if I'd gone first, maybe he'd still be here, or maybe we'd both be gone. But he never hesitated. He just did what he had to do. Walt's hand tightened on his cup again. Good men make choices others don't understand, he said. They act not because they're fearless, but because somebody has to. That's the difference. Caleb swallowed the lump in his throat. But the guilt, you carry it, Walt said. You don't run from it. You honor it. That's what makes you human. They sat in that for a while, just 2 men, generations apart, speaking the same language. Loss. Then Caleb leaned forward. So why Marcy's? Of all places, why here? Walt shrugged. They leave me alone. Don't ask questions. They keep the coffee hot. But you knew one day someone would recognize you. I figured if it happened, it happened. Caleb took a deep breath. I think people need your story, sir. I don't owe the world anything, Walt said calmly. But maybe I owe it to the boys who didn't come back. But if Walt was going to speak, it wouldn't be all at once, because some truths take years to say out loud. Walt leaned forward, his hands flat on the table now. They were large, worn, with thick fingers that looked like they'd once bent steel. Caleb noticed the way he kept rubbing the inside of his wrist, just under the tattoo, like something still ached there, long after the wound had healed. You really want to know what happened? Walt asked. Caleb didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Walt exhaled through his nose, slow, heavy, like drawing breath from the bottom of a well. It was 69 August. We were northeast of Quang Tri. Me and 5 others, young, dumb, thought we were invisible. Caleb nodded slowly, already picturing it. We were sent in to recon a supposed weapons drop. Intel said we'd be out in 2 days. Light movement, minimal contact, all the usual lies. Walt's voice was even, but his eyes were drifting, away from the diner, away from the booth. He was somewhere else now. We dropped at dusk. Thick canopy, no comms. Too much interference from the storm. We hiked through mud, waist deep in some places. Leeches, bugs, snipers in trees. Nobody talks about the jungle being alive. But it is. And it doesn't care who you are. Caleb listened, barely breathing. Second day, we spotted movement. Real quick. Maybe a dozen VC. No weapons drop. Just a trap. They opened fire from 3 sides. Walt's hand twitched, almost involuntarily. First round hit Jenkins in the chest. He was new, barely shaved, screamed once, then nothing. We dropped, returned fire, but it was chaos. Trees blowing apart, dirt flying. Couldn't tell who was hit. I tried to move left, flank him, but something exploded near my leg. Thought it was a mine. Turned out to be a grenade. He tapped his shin through his jeans. Snapped my fibula in 2 places. I went down hard. Thought I was done. But you weren't, Caleb said quietly. No, Walt said, because I looked up and saw Gomez bleeding out 10 feet away. Guy was crying for his mom. Had a chunk of metal in his neck. And I thought, if I just lay here, we all die. He rubbed his face slow and hard. So I crawled, dragged Gomez first, tied a tourniquet with my own damn shirt, then pulled him back behind a fallen tree, went out again, got another, and another. I didn't think about it. I just moved, shot when I had to. Mostly, I just kept dragging. Caleb was still, his face tight. 2 died before the dust-off arrived, Walt said. Fenton and Jenkins. 3 made it, barely. But the brass didn't like the story, said we weren't even supposed to be there, so they classified the report, wrapped it in red tape, told us to shut our mouths. Caleb's jaw clenched. They gave me a Purple Heart in a plain envelope, Walt said. No ceremony, no cameras, just a pat on the back and a list of things I wasn't allowed to talk about. He sat back in the booth, looked like he hadn't told that story out loud in decades. I told my mama I was coming home a hero, Walt whispered. She cried when she saw my leg. She thought heroes walked tall. The words hung between them, raw, heavy, real. You were a hero, Caleb said firmly. No, Walt replied. I was a Marine who didn't want to die. That's different. Caleb looked down, hands folded, then said, the fact you remember all their names, that says everything. Walt didn't answer. He just looked out the window again, rain streaking down like tears. I've only told that story once before, Walt said. To who? Caleb asked. A bartender in Jacksonville. I was drunk. He wasn't listening. This time, Caleb smiled, just a little. You ever think about writing it down? I've thought about burning it down, Walt said, but it always finds me. They sat there in silence again, not awkward, not strained, just quiet, like 2 men watching something old and sacred settle between them. But there was still one part of the story Caleb didn't know, the part that haunted Walt more than anything else. Caleb kept his eyes on Walt, trying to read the silence. Not the kind of silence that begged to be broken, but the kind that felt like a burden carried too long, too deep for words, too heavy for strangers. But Caleb wasn't a stranger anymore, not after what he'd heard. I've carried a lot of gear, Caleb said finally. Heavy plates, ammo, radios, rucks that dig into your spine, but none of that compares to what you've been carrying. Walt didn't smile. He didn't deny it either. There's weight, he said, and then there's guilt, and guilt never shifts. It just settles. Caleb took a sip of his coffee, now lukewarm. You blame yourself? I do, Walt said plainly. Not for the ones who died. I couldn't change that. But for the ones who lived. Caleb's brow furrowed. I don't get it. Walt looked down at his hands, turning one palm over like he was expecting to see blood. Gomez made it back. So did Bradley and Monroe. I visited Gomez once, years later. Found him in a halfway house outside of Baltimore. Man was hooked on painkillers, barely remembered his own name. He rubbed his temple slowly. Bradley didn't make it past 84, put a shotgun in his mouth, left a note that just said, "No more dreams." Caleb stared at him, stunned. Monroe's the only one I lost touch with, Walt said. Part of me hopes he found peace, but I doubt it. That's not your fault, Caleb said, almost pleading. Walt gave him a look. I dragged them out of a jungle, son, but I couldn't pull them out of what came after. He leaned back. His posture sagged under something that had no name. There's a lie they tell you when you come home, Walt said, that you'll adjust, that time heals, that honor makes the pain worth it. And it doesn't? Caleb asked. Walt shook his head. Honor is for the living, but the dead, they just want rest. And most of us, we don't get that until the noise stops, and it never really stops. Caleb swallowed hard. He thought about Amir, about Morales, about the dreams that came in flashes, dust, blood, silence. He looked Walt in the eye. You ever talk to anyone about it? You mean shrink? Walt asked. Yeah. Once, at the VA, guy had soft hands and a notebook. He told me I had survivor's guilt, gave me pills, said it'd pass. Did it? No, I just stopped showing up. They sat quietly for a moment. The clink of dishes in the background was the only sound. You know what the worst part is? Walt said suddenly. I was more alive in that jungle, bleeding, scared, half crazy, than I've ever felt since. Caleb nodded slowly. I get that. Walt looked over at him. You seen that too? Yeah. When we were in the mountains last year, it rained for 6 days straight. We were sleeping in mud, eating cold rations, running on 3 hours of sleep. But there was this one night. The team was circled up, watching the ridgeline, and I felt clear, focused, like everything made sense. He paused. Then we got back home, and I couldn't sleep in a bed without hearing mortars. Walt chuckled. You ain't crazy. You're just stuck. That ever go away? Not really, Walt said, but you learn how to carry it better. How? Caleb asked. Walt took a deep breath. By finding one thing that's real. One thing that makes staying worth it. Could be a person. Could be a promise. Could be pancakes. Caleb cracked a smile. Pancakes? Walt smirked. Marcy's does 'em right on Fridays. Keeps me showing up. A beat passed. Caleb looked down at his plate, then out the window, then back at Walt. I think my one thing might be sitting right across from me. Walt didn't respond right away, but something softened in his face, just a little. You don't have to carry this alone, Caleb said. I know, Walt replied, but sometimes you do, so others don't have to. But Caleb had one last question burning in his chest, and it was the one Walt had never answered, not even to himself. Rain still tapped the windows like a rhythm only the old knew by heart. Outside, the streets were almost empty. Inside Marcy's, the coffee pots hissed quietly, and the waitress behind the counter was humming something off-key. But at the booth near the window, the storm was inside too, just hidden behind the eyes of two men who'd seen too much. Caleb didn't rush the question. He let it sit in the space between them, rising slow in his chest like steam from a pot. Can I ask you something personal? He said, watching Walt's face closely. Walt looked amused. More personal than dragging half a squad through a jungle with a busted leg? Caleb gave a soft laugh. Fair, but yeah. Walt took a sip of coffee. Go ahead. Caleb hesitated, then leaned in. Do you regret it? Walt didn't move at first, just blinked once. Then he turned his gaze to the window, where a kid and his dad were sprinting through the rain toward a parked car, laughing like the water meant nothing. Every day, Walt said finally. Caleb nodded slowly, expecting that. But not for the reason you think, Walt added. I don't regret going. I don't regret the pain, the scars, the noise. I regret what I brought home. I regret who I became. Quiet, bitter, afraid to open up because people look at you different when they know what you've done. Caleb said nothing. I watched men die with their eyes open. I felt bones break under my hands while trying to stop the bleeding. I smelled rot in places where nothing should have lived, and then I came home and got asked if I enjoyed the adventure. He looked Caleb dead in the eyes. It wasn't an adventure. It was survival. Bare, ugly survival. And the minute you stop pretending it was glorious, people stop wanting to hear about it. Caleb clenched his jaw. You ever wish you'd stayed invisible? He asked. I did stay invisible, Walt said, by choice, until today. Why now? Caleb asked. Walt looked at him for a long time, then he shrugged. Maybe because you didn't ask for a story. You asked for the truth. He folded his hands on the table, and because part of me is tired of pretending I never mattered. Caleb swallowed hard. You matter, he said. I mean, I know I'm just one guy, but when I was in training, there were nights when I wanted to quit. But I kept thinking, If that old recon story is true, if one man could carry 5 others out of hell, then maybe I've got more in me than I thought. Walt's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Not quite sadness. That's the funny part, he said. I didn't think about legacy. I just wanted to live. And now here you are, carrying my name around like it means something. It does mean something, Caleb said. To people like me, it means everything. The rain outside began to slow. I don't have kids, Walt said. Never married. Too angry. Too detached. I figured no one would remember me once I was gone. Well, Caleb said, pushing his plate aside, you were wrong about that. Walt chuckled softly. Doesn't happen often. But yeah, I guess I was. They sat quietly again, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that had to be said finally had room to breathe. I don't think the world forgets us, Caleb said, eyes low. I think it waits, for moments like this, for someone to say, I see you, I know what you gave. Walt nodded slowly. Maybe you're right, he said. Then with a glance at the rain-spattered window, maybe today's the first day I stop hiding. But for that to happen, one more thing had to be said. And Caleb was the only person in that diner bold enough to say it. Caleb shifted forward in his seat, elbows on the table, hands clasped. He didn't know why the next words felt so heavy, but they did. Maybe because this whole conversation hadn't just been about Walt, it had been about him, too. About all the veterans who made it home but never really came back. Can I tell you something? He asked, voice quieter now. Walt glanced up, eyes steady. Go ahead. Caleb took a breath. There's this thing that happens to me sometimes. I'll be driving or lying in bed, and out of nowhere, I'll see Morales' face, or hear the sound of that blast. It's like it hits me again, full force. I feel frozen, and no one around me knows it's happening. They're laughing or scrolling their phones, and I'm sitting there sweating through my shirt like I'm back in Ramadi. Walt didn't interrupt. He just listened. I told a girl I was dating, Caleb continued, and she said, just don't think about it, like it was a bad dream. But it's not a dream. It's always there, just under the surface. You know what I mean? Walt nodded once. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. Some nights, I think maybe it would have been easier to not come back. Walt's stare sharpened. Don't ever say that. I'm just being honest. And I respect that, Walt said, leaning forward. But you listen to me, and you listen good. You made it back for a reason. You carry them because you have to, not because you deserve to suffer. Morales wouldn't want you stuck like this. None of them would. You're here. That matters. Caleb nodded, but his hands were shaking slightly. Pain doesn't mean you're broken, Walt said. It means you're human. You feel it because you should. The day it stops hurting is the day you lose what makes you different from a weapon. They sat in the booth, 2 soldiers separated by 5 decades, but tethered by the same invisible cord. I think, Caleb started, then hesitated. I think you're the first person who's ever understood me. Walt looked down at his empty plate. That's because the only people who really get it are the ones who've been through it. No training can prepare you. No medal makes up for it. All we have is each other, and too many of us suffer alone. Caleb looked up. So what do we do? Walt thought for a long time. Then he said, we stop hiding. We talk. We let ourselves be seen. Even if it's just once. Even if it's just at a diner with someone we didn't expect. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled napkin. Slowly, he scribbled something down and slid it across the table. What's this? Caleb asked. Number for a guy I used to know. Runs a support group for vets. Nothing fancy. No judgment. Just a room full of people who've seen the same dark. You show up, you talk, or you just sit and listen. No pressure. Caleb looked at the napkin, folded it once and tucked it into his wallet. I'll go, he said. Walt nodded. Good. And when you're ready, you tell your story. Because someone out there needs to hear you. Caleb looked at him, his expression a mix of gratitude and awe. Why me? Walt smiled, tired but warm. Because you're the first person who ever saw me and didn't look away. The rain had stopped. Sunlight peeked through the gray clouds outside, bouncing off the wet pavement. Caleb stood up, reached out his hand. Walt looked at it, then shook it firmly, without hesitation. "Thank you," Caleb said, "for everything." "Same to you, son," Walt replied. "Keep showing up." Caleb turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Friday, huh? Pancakes?" Walt chuckled. "Best in town." Caleb gave him a small salute, then stepped out into the light. Walt sat back, watched him go. Then he picked up his cup and took one last sip of cold coffee. And for the first time in years, the booth didn't feel so heavy. There are people out there like Walt and Caleb, quiet, carrying more than they let on. If this story meant something to you, share it. Call someone. Check on the vets in your life. Let them know they matter. Because sometimes, the heaviest weight isn't what you carried overseas. It's what you carry when you come home.